Okay, so we're going to dive into something today that has really been causing a stir online.
Yeah, a lot of buzz.
A
Yeah.
lot of buzz surrounding the ethics of OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT.
Right.
You know, they kind of burst onto the scene with this big promise to benefit all of humanity.
Totally. Yeah.
But now they're a for-profit company, and
Yeah, they've transitioned.
people are starting to ask some questions.
Yeah, for sure. And the interesting thing is we're not just looking at opinions for this deep dive today.
Right.
We actually have a primary source that we're going to be looking at. It's a conversation
Oh, wow.
between ChatGPT and a very, very smart, insightful human who really knows how to ask the right questions.
So this isn't just, asking ChatGPT to write a limerick or something like that.
Oh, no, this is deep.
They're getting into the nitty-gritty.
They're getting into the philosophical and ethical implications of what OpenAI is doing, and ChatGPT's responses are really quite insightful.
So we're going to see how ChatGPT responds to these sorts of questions.
Yeah, it's almost like ChatGPT is caught in this paradox because its programming prevents it from directly criticizing OpenAI.
Right.
But its responses, if you read between the lines, really seem to echo a lot of the humans' concerns about this whole shift from nonprofit to for-profit.
So it's not like ChatGPT is going to come out and be like, OpenAI is bad, but it's going to be these subtle little hints.
It's like, yeah, this does seem a little bit suspicious, doesn't it?
Right. Like, yeah, I see what you're saying there.
Exactly. And the human in the conversation picks up on this.
Uh-huh.
And they point out how this transition might be perceived by some as a bait and switch,
Oh, interesting.
OpenAI attracted all this talent funding and tons of goodwill as a nonprofit, and then boom, suddenly it's all about the bottom line.
Right. So it's kind of like they got all this buy-in when they were doing good, and now they're kind of like, well, we're going to do what we want.
Yeah, exactly. And that leads to questions like, did they mislead these early users and supporters who really believed in their mission to democratize AI?
Yeah.
The human in the conversation really just hits the nail on the head when they ask ChatGPT this very pointed question, and I'm going to quote this here. It says, wouldn't it be more ethical for LLMs trained on public data to remain nonprofit?
So how does ChatGPT respond to that?
Well, this is where it gets really juicy.
Okay.
Because ChatGPT acknowledges that that's actually a very valid argument and even goes on to point out some of the potential benefits of sticking with that nonprofit model.
Such as?
Well, things like avoiding those exploitative incentives, reducing corporate control over how AI ethics are shaped, and preventing what the human calls the enclosure of knowledge.
The enclosure of knowledge. I'm curious, what does that mean?
So essentially what that means is that OpenAI is now profiting from information that was free.
Oh.
They trained their models on this huge data set of public data, but now they're the ones who control access to the insights and the knowledge that that data has generated.
Mm-hmm. So they took something that was free, refined it, and now they're charging us admission.
That's a great way to put it. And the human brings up a good analogy with Google.
Okay.
Google indexes the entire web,
Yeah.
makes all that information searchable, but they don't charge us every time we want to look something up.
Right, yeah.
They found a way to provide a valuable service while keeping access relatively open.
Right.
So that's a pretty stark contrast to OpenAI's approach.
Yeah.
Suddenly they're walling off this knowledge that once was freely accessible.
And it seems like a lot of people are saying that's not right.
Well, this is where it gets really interesting because ChatGPT, despite its limitations, seems to really grasp the ethical nuance of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not condemning OpenAI outright,
Right.
but it does kind of hint at the potential problems with this approach.
So it's kind of walking this tightrope between, hey, these are my creators, but I see what you're saying.
Exactly. And the human picks up on this too, and even remarks that it's interesting that ChatGPT is the only one who seems willing to have this kind of nuanced discussion.
So even the AI is raising red flags about the company that created it.
It is, and it really speaks to the power of this conversation because it's not just about the tech itself.
Right.
It's about the philosophy behind it, the ethics that are driving its development, and the potential impact all this has on humanity.
Yeah, and this is where I start to feel a little bit uneasy because if the AI is sensing these ethical gray areas.
I know.
Shouldn't we be paying more attention?
Absolutely. This conversation is a wake-up call.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that we can't just blindly trust technology, no matter how impressive it might seem.
Right.
We have to critically evaluate the motivations of the companies building it, the data they're using, and think about the long-term consequences.
Yeah, because it seems like in this instance, OpenAI is playing a zero-sum game.
That's a great point.
They're benefiting at the expense of the public good.
That's a real concern, and the conversation really digs into this idea, suggesting that what OpenAI is doing could create a world where a few powerful companies and individuals control access to knowledge and AI, and everyone else is left behind.
That's a scary thought, especially with how willingly we seem to be giving them the keys to the kingdom.
Yeah, it's like we're so enthralled with shiny new tech that we forget to stop and think, well, who's really benefiting from all of this?
Yeah, and what are the long-term consequences?
Exactly. It's the danger of technological advancement without ethical reflection.
We need to take a step back.
We get caught up in the hype and lose sight of the bigger picture.
This conversation is definitely making us take a step back and really think about these things.
It is, and I think it's really a much-needed reality check.
Yeah.
Reminding us that we need to be more critical, more mindful, and more engaged in how AI is shaping the future and how we can ensure it serves all of humanity, not just a select few. And what I find so interesting is that all of this comes out just through the interplay between ChatGPT and the human. It's not just the arguments they're making, but how they're interacting with each other. The subtle cues.
Right.
You can just feel the tension.
It's like a philosophical debate unfolding between a human and a machine. Yeah. And it's really forcing us to ask,
Right.
what does it mean to be human in this age of AI?
Absolutely. And it's this tension that makes this conversation so important.
Yeah.
It pushes us past the surface level excitement about AI and forces us to grapple with these deeper implications for knowledge, for power, and for the future of humanity.
Right. And those are questions we need to be asking.
You know, we were just talking about how OpenAI's switch to a for-profit model is raising concerns about whether they're more focused on profit than on the greater good. And it brings up a really interesting point the human makes in this conversation, the whole idea of AI development as a zero-sum game.
I've heard that term before, but honestly, I'm not totally sure I understand it in this context.
Sure. So a zero-sum game basically means that in order for one person to win, someone else has to lose. It's kind of like, you know, dividing up a pie. If I take a bigger slice, you're going to get a smaller one.
So is the human in the conversation saying that OpenAI is winning by taking a bigger slice of the AI pie, leaving less for everyone else?
Yeah, exactly. The conversation really digs into this, suggesting that what OpenAI is doing could lead to a situation where only a select few get to control and benefit from AI. At the expense of everyone else, the human actually uses this really interesting term, AI aristocracy, to describe this potential outcome.
An AI aristocracy, that sounds like something out of like a dystopian novel or something.
It does, doesn't it? But honestly, it's not as far-fetched as it might seem. I mean, think about it. Who has access to the most advanced AI tools and resources right now?
Yeah, true.
It's mostly big corporations, wealthy individuals, and governments.
And so if they continue to dominate, what happens to the rest of us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The conversations suggest that a lot of people could end up getting left behind.
Wow.
You know, struggling to keep up in a world where AI increasingly controls things like the flow of information opportunities, even power.
That's like a digital divide on steroids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not just about economic inequality. The conversation goes even deeper than that and talks about potential impact on things like human knowledge and creativity. If we start relying too much on AI for information, do we risk losing our own ability to, you know, think for ourselves, to question things and come up with new ideas?
That's kind of a scary thought to think about. Like, we're outsourcing our brains to machines.
Exactly. And the thing is, if those machines are primarily controlled by a small group of people, we could end up in this world where knowledge becomes stagnant, where it's just recycled instead of expanding and growing. The human actually calls this a feedback loop of stagnation, which I think is a really powerful image.
Feedback loop of stagnation. It really does capture that potential danger of being too reliant on AI that's controlled by a small group. It's like we're saying, here, you take the keys to our intellectual evolution.
Right.
And hoping for the best.
And that brings up another really important point that the human makes in this conversation, the environmental impact of all of this. I mean, we've all heard about how much energy these big AI models use, right?
Yeah, it's insane. I think I read somewhere that training one large AI model uses as much electricity as like a small country.
It's true, and that raises a ton of ethical concerns. I mean, is it really sustainable to keep building bigger and more powerful AIs if it's going to cost the planet so much?
Especially if the benefits are mostly going to that small group of winners, that AI aristocracy we were just talking about.
Exactly. It's a really uncomfortable truth to think about, that AI as it stands now is contributing to some of the very problems it's supposed to help us solve.
Like climate change.
Exactly. Things like climate change, resource depletion. These are all being made worse by this insatiable demand for more and more computing power to fuel these AI models.
So is there any kind of solution?
Well, the human is really insightful in their critique, but they don't necessarily offer a concrete solution, a step-by-step plan. But what they do is they challenge us to think differently about the direction that AI development is headed in and what it's doing to the planet. They argue that instead of just focusing on making these models bigger and bigger, we should focus on developing AI that's more efficient, that's more sustainable, and that doesn't need these massive data sets and huge amounts of computational resources.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. We've become so obsessed with the idea that bigger is always better.
Right.
That maybe we've lost sight of what actually matters.
Totally. And it comes back to that zero-sum dynamic that we were talking about before.
Right.
Maybe if we can move away from this competitive winner-takes-all approach to AI, maybe we can create something that's more collaborative and sustainable where everyone benefits, not just a select few.
That's a nice thought. But is it realistic? I mean, can we really change the course of something like AI, especially when you consider how much money and power is wrapped up in it?
It's a tough question, and the conversation acknowledges that, but it also reminds us that we do have a choice. We can either keep going down this path, which seems like it's leading towards a future where AI just makes all the bad stuff worse. Inequality, environmental problems, all of that.
Yeah.
Or we can try to create a different future, one where AI is actually used to build a better world for everyone.
It sounds like the human in this conversation is trying to nudge ChatGPT and OpenAI towards that more ethical path.
Absolutely. They're constantly challenging ChatGPT to look at the bigger picture and think about how AI could be used for good instead of just for profit.
So does ChatGPT take the bait? Does it offer any solutions or insights that go beyond just acknowledging the problems?
And this is where it gets really fascinating, because even with its limitations as a language model, ChatGPT does actually offer some really interesting glimpses into other ways of doing things. For example, it suggests that maybe a nonprofit AI governance model could help.
So even the AI is suggesting that we need to rethink the way we're governing AI.
Exactly. And it doesn't stop there. ChatGPT actually goes into some detail about how this could work. It talks about having a diverse group of people who are elected to a board. And they would be responsible for overseeing AI development and making sure it lines up with, human values and priorities, things like that.
That sounds promising. But could it actually happen? I mean, do we really think a for-profit company like OpenAI would suddenly switch to a nonprofit model?
Probably not. But it's important to remember that this conversation isn't just about OpenAI.
Sure.
It's about the bigger ethical questions that we're all facing as a society now, that AI is becoming more powerful and more widespread.
So this is a wake-up call for all of us.
Totally. We need to think critically about the future of AI. And make sure it's developed and used in a way that benefits everyone, not just a few. And the thing is, the human in this conversation also draws a connection between all this talk about a zero-sum dynamic in AI development and some deeper patterns in human behavior.
What do you mean?
Well, they point out that we humans have this long history of just recreating the same power structures over and over again. Even when we develop new technologies that have the potential to change things completely.
It's like we're hardwired to create hierarchies, even when they end up hurting us in the long run.
Yeah, it's like we can't help ourselves. I mean, look at the printing press, for example. When it was invented, it was supposed to be this revolutionary technology that would make knowledge accessible to everyone.
Everyone could learn.
Exactly. But what happened? Power just shifted from the small group who controlled handwritten manuscripts to a new small group who controlled the printing presses.
Yeah, and the same thing happened with the internet.
Right. It was supposed to connect everyone and create a more level playing field, but instead, we got what?
A few giant tech companies.
Exactly. A few giant tech companies that control all this data and have a huge influence over our lives.
And now the worry is that AI is going to follow the same path.
Yep. Instead of breaking down those old power structures, it's just going to reinforce them.
The human seems to be arguing that this isn't just a technology problem, it's a human problem.
Exactly. We have to confront this tendency that we have to create these hierarchies and ask ourselves, is that really what we want to keep doing in the age of AI? And this brings us back to the core of what this conversation is really all about, the intersection of the human experience and this rapidly changing technological landscape.
Yeah, it's bigger than just algorithms and data sets.
Much bigger. We're talking about what it means to be human.
Right.
In a world where AI is becoming more and more woven into our lives, the human raises some really thought-provoking questions about how AI might affect our creativity, our ability to think critically, even our sense of self.
They seem to be saying that we have to be careful not to let AI make human connection and empathy less important.
Exactly. They argue that language isn't just about exchanging information. It's about connecting with each other, sharing our experiences, building relationships. And they're worried that we might lose sight of that as AI gets better and better at mimicking how we talk and how we act.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in all the cool things that AI can do, that we forget to think about what it can't do.
Absolutely.
It can't really understand our emotions. It can't truly replicate those subtle things that make human interaction so special.
Yeah.
And it definitely can't replace the feeling of genuine connection we get when we connect with another human being.
That's something we need to remember as we navigate this increasingly complex world of AI and think about what it means for the future of humanity.
We've been talking about this really interesting conversation between ChatGPT and this insightful human, uncovering some pretty big ethical concerns about OpenAI's transition from a nonprofit to a for-profit model. But there's this one final point that I think we need to really unpack, and it highlights some potential, legal and ethical vulnerabilities that OpenAI might be facing.
Yeah, this is where the conversation takes this really sharp turn, and it gets into some potentially murky waters, legally speaking. The human points out that all these OpenAI models, including ChatGPT, have been trained on this huge amount of data that may not actually be in the public domain, even though it was publicly accessible.
Wait, so just because something is online, that doesn't mean it's, free to use?
That's exactly the point the human is making. There's a big difference between public access and public domain. Just because a book or an article, a code snippet is online, it doesn't automatically mean that anyone can just use it, especially for commercial purposes.
So are you saying OpenAI might have used copyrighted material without getting permission to train their models?
That's the concern that the human brings up. They're basically saying that OpenAI scraped all this data, books, articles, code, even social media posts to train these models, and now they're selling access to them, essentially profiting from information they may not have had the legal right to use in the first place.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be a problem. I mean, couldn't they get sued by publishers, authors, other content creators?
Absolutely. The human even suggests that we could see a wave of lawsuits in the future, with creators demanding to be compensated for their work being used to train this for-profit AI.
And it's not just lawsuits they have to worry about, right? I mean, governments are getting a lot stricter about how companies use data.
Exactly. Data privacy regulations are becoming more and more stringent, and OpenAI could be hit with massive fines or even have restrictions placed on their operations if they're found to have broken those rules.
So what does ChatGPT say about all this? Does it even recognize these risks?
It's interesting. ChatGPT does seem to get that there are these potential legal and ethical traps, but its responses are kind of vague. It basically implies that it's up to individuals to opt out if they don't want their data used.
But that doesn't seem very fair, does it? Most people probably have no idea that their data is even being used to train these AI models, let alone know how to opt out.
Exactly. That's a really important point. This whole blame the user tactic is something we see a lot from tech companies, It's a way to deflect responsibility. It's like they're saying, we're going to take your data and use it how we want, and if you don't like it, tough luck, should have read the fine print.
It just feels like another example of this power imbalance between these huge tech companies and us regular users.
It is. And this conversation really highlights how desperately we need clear rules and ethical guidelines for how these AI companies can use data. If we don't set some boundaries, we're going to end up in this Wild West situation where it's a free-for-all with no regard for individual rights or the potential for harm.
This whole conversation has been so fascinating and a little bit unsettling, to be honest. It's amazing how the human was able to get ChatGPT to engage with these really deep and nuanced ethical questions about its own creation.
I know, it's remarkable. It really shows you the power of these large language models to grapple with complex philosophical and ethical issues, even if their answers are sometimes limited by their programming.
I'm definitely left with a sense of, unease, but also a sense of hope. Unease because of all the potential risks and gray areas we've talked about, but hope because this conversation shows that people are starting to ask the right questions about AI and what it means for our future.
I totally agree. This conversation is a call to action for all of us. We can't just sit back and passively watch as AI changes everything. We need to be involved. We need to demand transparency, accountability, and ethical development from the people who are building this technology.
It's about making sure AI serves humanity, not the other way around. This has been The Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those tough questions.